Right. Just a little bit of housekeeping. Welcome to the History Workshops webinar series. Today is our last webinar for the year, for the academic year. And we're very pleased to have Professor David Dean joining us from Canada. It's very early where he is, so thank you for waking up early and to speak with us. So just a quick bio. Professor David Dean teaches public history and British history at Carleton University in Ottawa, Canada. He's a member of the steering committee of the International Federation for Public History and co-edits its journal, International Public History. He recently published Migration and Stereotypes in Performance and Culture. And the topic of Professor Dean's talk is Historians, Publics, and Public History, from consultancy to collaboration to co-production. I think people who have been coming to our webinar series noted that we've had a couple of webinars with the theme of public history this term, and I think Professor Dean's paper wraps a lot of the themes together in a very clear way. I really enjoyed reading the paper. My name is Kasonde. I'll be moderating today. I'm a postgraduate student in the history workshop. Just a couple of housekeeping things. We are recording this session, so please be aware of that. A recording of this session will be made available on the History Workshops YouTube channel. And secondly, after Professor Dean talks for 20 minutes, we will open up for discussion. Please feel free to put your comments in the chat while he's talking, but we'll have more time to have a discussion afterwards. So I'll hand over to Professor Dean, and yeah.
Great. Okay. Thanks very much, Cassandra, for the lovely introduction, and thank you everyone for the welcome and the invitation. I'm speaking from Canada, and you can probably see it's still quite gloomy outside, but I want to acknowledge that I teach and work and live on the unceded territory of the Anishinaabe people of Ontario, and acknowledge their custodianship of the land. I'm a descendant of settlers, English immigrants in the 1950s, and that's my position here in Ottawa, Ontario. And I'm very pleased to talk to you about public history and publics today. And I'm really going to focus on a personal journey, because I think many of you will share my sense that I didn't really know I was a public historian until my colleague Del, who's listening here today, explained to me that my work as an activist historian in Britain and New Zealand enabled me to call myself a public historian. And this happened around 2002 when we set up our program at Public History at Carleton. And I've gradually become more of a public historian than I've been a British historian, although I think there's a conversation between the two. But what I really want to talk today then about is my journey as a public historian. But to set it up, I want to talk about what we mean by public history, and particularly the two elements of that phrase. One is the public and one is history. So I'm going to, everyone can see my PowerPoint. I'll move through it. Some of these ideas and questions came to light through a conference that Joanna Voyden organized in Poland, in Wrocław, on public and public history, which then became a publication. And the call for papers, as if you've had a chance to read the chapter that we sent out, talks about history in the public sphere as a definition of public history. And so it's history for the public, it's history about the public, history by the public, and history with the public. And each of those suggests different audiences or different publics. History for, history about the public, suggests that the public is a little passive in its consumption of historical representations produced by us specialists, those of us trained in history. Whereas history with and by the public suggests a different sort of involvement of the historical specialist, the trained historian, and more of agency with the public itself, or with publics, as I prefer to say. And as those of you who've looked at the chapter will know, in thinking about the public in public history, I turned to two fields that I've been working with over the last few years, one being public pedagogy and one being performance. And scholars of public pedagogy are very interested, obviously, in audiences, in publics. And Gert Biesta has come up with this typology of pedagogy that's aimed at the public and pedagogy that's done by the public, which corresponds to the description of the call for papers for the conference I just mentioned. But he also talks about the enactment of becoming public, that it is activist in that it's in process. It's experimental in that it offers new ways of doing something, and it shows how to do things differently. So it's demonstrative. And this dynamic element of becoming public, I think, speaks to a whole conversation that was initiated by Habermas, and of course has become quite a famous discussion in the 20th century, end of the 20th century, about publics and the public sphere. And I won't go into any of that today, but suffices to say that has been very influential. And another scholar of pedagogy has come up with a typology of political publics, which are sort of what we might say top-down public history associated with official representations, officially commissioned representations of the past. Popular publics, we might call this history from below, unofficial sort of publics, and then concrete publics, which are actually contained audiences and self-selected, and theater would be, a theater audience is a good example of that. So from these sort of understandings of publics through the field of public pedagogy and political theory, social theory, through Habermas and the public sphere, we could also look at performance studies. And in performance studies, of course, because they're very concerned with audiences, they have theorized extensively about what they mean by the public and by publics, and whether they're passive consumers or moderately passive, facilitated, but they have some agency, or whether they have full agency. And this typology, if you like, on a scale from a very passive audience to a very engaged, and in fact, an audience that has a lot of agency in the historical representation that is being produced, is in some ways my journey as a public historian. And just to wrap this little bit up, the public historians have, of course, always had to think about their publics. As an academic historian, when I publish a monograph, I'm not really thinking about my audience when I write it. I'm thinking more about my colleagues and how it's going to be received by my fellow specialists. But when I'm engaged with supporting a theater production or a street installation or an exhibit that's going to be seen by people, I'm much more thoughtful about audiences and much more thoughtful about the public. And in fact, the public's reaction to some of those historical representations could actually determine whether I get to do others. So if the public objects to the street installations that I've been part of installing in the city for the last 5 years, we won't get to do any more. And so the public has an impact on my work in a way that the public has never really had an impact on my work in British history. my colleagues have, but not the public itself. And of course, public historians working in museums and living history sites, heritage sites, have to think very carefully about attracting people and how they want to attract people. So they operationalize publics. And in my paper, the chapter, I talk a little bit about the Canadian Museums of History's strategy to understand the people that it wants to get through the doors. So public history then I suggest that we stop using the word public and the general public. We start talking about publics to recognizing the diversity of publics. We see it as a dynamic process from a passive public to a very participatory public, or with a lot of agency, and that we recognize that also one of the differentials between public history and other forms of history is that we are very concerned with and have to engage with and are affected by the public. So if public historians are concerned about the public, how do they represent this? Well, one of the challenges we have, or I had a few years ago, was to think about my book cover. And we had a challenge with the International Public History Journal as well. So here's a variety of book covers on public history. And as you can see, many of us writing about public history turn to the sites of public history as illustrations on our book covers, whether we're talking about reenactments or living history museums or monuments. In my involvement with the journal International Public History, we have on the upper right here, we have a group of a large number of people in the public sphere as our representation. But here you have challenges such as the graffiti and a monument, for example, in the space in the Oxford Handbook. And we have a living room as an archive in the People's and Their Pasts books. My own challenge was for the companion to public history, and I wanted to capture something that was a bit more dynamic, or at least seemed dynamic to me. And this is the courtyard of the Amsterdam Museum, in which it used to be an orphan's school, and the museum turned the orphans, the children's cubbies, little cupboards that they put their belongings in before they went into the school, into an exhibit space. But more importantly for me, they also share that exhibit space and open it up to the community. So community members, community partners can stage exhibits in these cubbies, as you can see here. So for me, this represented public history in a very dynamic way, because it's about heritage sites, the reuse of heritage sites in the present. It's about museums as a major site of public history, but it's all about community outreach and surrendering the museum's authority to facilitate communities to tell their own stories in their own ways in a very public space. So that was my take on it. And how did I get there? This book was published in 2018, and I agonized over the cover quite a lot. The publisher came up with a very strange set of images as well for their suggestion, but I won't go into that too much. But they were very elitist, let's say, of very wealthy people. One of them was very wealthy people holding champagne glasses, looking at an artwork in a major art gallery. Which didn't, so I knew that didn't capture what public history was, absolutely. So how did I get there in 2018? Well, my journey as a historian has been through several stages. First of all, and I've been thinking about this as a movement, if you like, from being a consultant to being a collaborator to being a co-producer. And I'm going to just illustrate this by talking about three things that I've been involved in. First of all, as a historical consultant to a national theater company. Secondly, as a collaborator with a local history museum, a museum without walls, the Workers' History Museum here in Ottawa. And finally, the street installations that I alluded to earlier, where I've been in charge of a project, but I see myself as a co-producer. So I want to take us through this process of what it means and link it back to the notions of the public and the passive versus the passive publics versus publics with a lot of agency, and my experience of this. So forgive the self-indulgence as I talk about myself and my journey, but and the occasional illustration too, just to prove that I really was there. So I was a consultant for the English Theatre Company for about 5 or 6 years, and involved in a number of productions, contemporary productions of 20th century plays like Vimy, which is a well-known battle in Canada, where some historians argue our nation, we became a real nation during the First World War, to Mother Courage, to King Lear, King Lear that was staged in, resituated in early Canada, in 17th century Canada, and Christmas Carol, which was staged in Victorian England. And as a consultant, I was there as to offer my research expertise. I realized that the acting company wanted historical context for the plays they were working on, either both the time period, so they're shifting context, really the time period of the play, but also the time period of the writing of the play. So Mother Courage was about 17th century, 30 Years' War. They wanted to know about that, but they also wanted to know about the life of Brecht and the period of the Second World War and the interwar period, but also how it spoke to issues today. They wanted to know about historical interpretation and historical debate. And these last two were quite contentious, because what I realized when I walked into these rehearsal rooms is that I was seen as a walking sort of encyclopedia, Wikipedia, that they wanted to know the facts, and they wanted to know whether this really happened or that really happened, or what this really looked like or what that really looked like, or, you know, what would a 17th century person do when they entered their house? What was the first thing they would do? And they wanted to know these with certainty. And of course, what I was offering as a historian was possibilities. I would say, well, historians disagree over this. And they would say, well, isn't the past the past? How can historians disagree? They were uncomfortable with historical debate, depending on your perspectives as a historian. And so these uncertainties were not really what they were searching for from me. They were searching for definitive answers to certain questions. And so this was a really interesting process of engagement, because it was the first time I saw how public see historians, and it wasn't really what we do. It was in part what we do. Of course, I could answer lots of questions, and I could raise possibilities, and give them all the resources they needed, both archival sources, visual sources, but also talk about the debates and and see these debates and various interpretations as opportunities. But what I also realized was that through this process of working is that what was the dramaturgs and the actors and the directors were doing was very similar to what I do as a historian. We go through a process where we read the original source, the script at table work. We then get up on our feet, and the whole process is blocked. The production is blocked as people move and do gestures and speak in relation to each other and embody what they're doing with movement. And then we have the rehearsal process, where things change all the time and adjustments are made. And then, of course, we have previews with the audience and adjustments made there. And in some ways, this is very similar to, you know, doing original research in the archive, using your imagination or your elements of your imagination to understand the archive, but also the creative process of writing, even if you're writing a monograph or an article. And then, of course, the revisions that we go through, and the rehearsal we go through with reviewers and so on. So there's a synergy between what I did as a historian in the process and also what we were doing in the theater. And one thing that I took away from that experience of being a consultant was that historians tend to see the need to be historically accurate, absolutely faithful to the source, in order to capture a degree of authenticity in our writing of the past. In theater, sometimes you have to be inaccurate in order to be authentic. And I can talk more about that in question time, but give you some examples of that. But I began to separate accuracy from authenticity and realize that there are moments where you use your imagination, perhaps because of the silence of an archive, a story that's not told, but you think was probably there. And in capturing that and talking about that, you're actually capturing something more authentic about the past than you would have done had you just been literally focused on accuracy and only saying what the archive said. Moving on to being a collaborator, I've been a collaborator for many years now with the Workers' History Museum, which is, as you can imagine, is focused on workers' history, labor history. This is an exhibit, the opening of exhibit of a heritage site where the museum took thousands of photographs of a E.B. Eddy site, which was a lumber mill site in Ottawa, and capturing lost heritage or disappearing heritage on very controversial territory. This is on stolen land from Indigenous peoples, and there's people, it's now turning into condo developments. And there's an argument to say the land should just be returned to Indigenous peoples. And I'm one of those who believes that should be happening, but it's not. Again, I was there to offer my expertise and interpretation and debate, but this time my audience, my public were fellow historians, although amateur historians, but people with a lot of experience in labor history, trade union history, far more experience than I could ever hope to have. And so these were activists who wanted to tell stories that they felt were disappearing, stories that were important to bring to the public's attention. This was, if you think of the theater aspect as being public history, which is sort of in many ways for the public, for an audience, and it was a concrete public. The collaboration with the Workers' History Museum has been really more about the public. It's been, well, I suppose it's really, yeah, public history for the public and about the public. And it's much more a sort of, I guess, a political element to it as well. But more importantly, this is popular history. This is history from below. This was history to tell stories that hadn't been told or were disappearing off the agenda. And the Workers' History Museum produces a variety of exhibits and films, calendars, and I've been involved in all of those. And it's a collaboration, of course, with designers and writers, artists, editors. And as a process of collaboration, it's not just about content then, which is part of my role as a historian, but it's much more about form, and a lot of compromises have to take place. There's context to talk about, but it's about the politics of the past and the politics of memory. And we're very much aware of the new context of the present, and particularly through the popular publics and the need to talk to the public about histories that have little known. So for example, labor activists are very keen to point out that certain rights and that we have at the moment were not givens. The state did not give these things. Capitalists did not give us these things. We had to fight very hard for equal pay or that sort of family leave and those sorts of things. And we shouldn't think of them as simply a given. So my role here was as a collaborator with fellow historians who weren't necessarily trained professionally, or almost none were, but who saw themselves as historians and understanding the past and its importance in the present. Finally, one of the links between the Workers' History Museum was a project we started in 2017 where we installed street installations across the city in the top right, you can see what these look like. These are traffic control boxes. So at every intersection, there's a box that controls the traffic lights. And these are, as you can see from the top right, just boring gray boxes. And what we've been doing is investigating historical stories, finding an archival image, wrapping these boxes with either an archival image, such as the one at the bottom right, or a painting, one on in the middle there, with a QR code that takes to a website, which you can see here on the upper left, where you can use a map to explore further, and also it's organized thematically. This has been an incredible collaboration. And in some ways, I started off as a consultant for Ottawa's history. I became a collaborator with the History Museum, but also we liaise with business improvement associations, with local community associations, local historians, artists, all sorts of collaborators in this. And what ended up being is that my role as a historian became, only one of many, and in fact, in some ways, not the most important one, because we had to do all sorts of compromises and make compromises, partly because, again, I had all that expertise, but now I was working for clients. I had to liaise with the City of Ottawa because this is City of Ottawa property. And so there are many stakeholders involved, as well as politicians involved. If anybody doesn't like these boxes, these installations, of which there's about 60 now across the city, they'd complain to their city councillor and they would disappear. So the publics have a big impact on the future of this project. I had to work within institutional structures, and my historical interpretation was less about the stories that I wanted to tell and more about the stories that I could tell, or how I could tell those stories, which meant in the way I became a co-producer. And some of these things I'm not all that happy with, to be frank with you. And I'll just give you the one example here in this image. You can see that we found a beautiful archival image of a street in Ottawa, with a little old lorry there and so on. And we colorized this image so that it would pop out on the street, as you can see from the bottom left, at the bottom there. But you'll notice that the two images are slightly different. And that's because up here, we are advertising, this shop is advertising Winchester cigarettes. And we had to block that out. We had to take that out because the City of Ottawa, who owns the property on which this canvas was presented, has a no smoking policy and is firmly within the belief that if you mention the word cigarettes or illustrate cigarettes in any way, you're promoting cigarette smoking. And so we had to take that out. And as a historian, this is hugely challenging, right? Distorting an archival image, changing a source, and taking it out because of present day concerns. And we can talk more about the challenges of that. But this is then official public history, if you like, but a concern about the audience and the publics in terms of policy making, in terms of perception. How will the public perceive this? And how do you need to, or you have to adjust the history you're making with that in mind? So this is public history about the public, but it's really as well about political publics. So I've moved then from being a consultant, using my expertise to produce history for the public, to a collaboration with history that's really about and with the public, to a co-production where the public has actually more agency than in some ways I do in the final say of what happens here, particularly the stakeholders and the City of Ottawa institutional frameworks like committees like health and safety or diversity committees, for example, as well as the traffic committee, because this is something that affects the traffic flow. And we need to be aware of that as well. So just coming to wrap up then, it's interesting for me then to go back to the work of many of my colleagues and think about how we conceptualize public history and how we present public history. because although I've spoken mainly about the publics in public history today, I hope what's come through is that this also raises issues about the history in public history, and where are the boundaries and where are the limits, and where will I move forward and where will I draw a line in the sand. To what extent will I change historical context? To what extent will I use my imagination in the theater so that something is inaccurate to capture what I think is something authentic about the period that I've been working on? To what extent am I willing to compromise in terms of design and content for exhibits or for calendars? And then finally, to what extent am I willing to change an archival source when it comes to doing a street installation? And it's interesting then to go back to a couple of my colleagues, and Serge is here today, his colleagues too in the International Federation, Thomas Covin, the president, and Anita Lucchesi, the treasurer, have come up with a couple of proposals or just visual statements of public history parallel to the book covers I talked about earlier. One is a word cloud. These were proposals for our conference in Brazil in 2018. And you can see history is very significant, but so too are some of the sites like heritage and museums, but also the dynamic process of identity, of politics, of trauma, of commemoration. And Thomas has got a more hierarchical structure with the roots of history, and then the leaves about the uses and the ways the varieties we communicate in public history. So I just threw those out as two visual representations, but for me, they symbolize or visualize the tensions that I've had as a consultant, as a collaborator, as a co-producer, between trying to get some sort of conversation going and what that conversation looks like between the public in public history and the history in public history. And so, you know, when I go back to this, I think about publics and stakeholders and collaborators. I also think of what we do as a historian, because the historian can get lost a little bit in these co-productions. And what we offer is not only a deep understanding of archives and sources, we have a unique understanding of historical debates and interpretations, as I said, rather than the certainties of the possibilities. We can talk about context in a way that other people find it very challenging to do. And what we're becoming very acutely aware of now is our importance to position ourselves and be reflexive about our work. And that's something that I've really learned through the process of being a collaborator and a co-producer. And I think that's really one of the things that's very distinctive about the way we do public history work, is that we are very reflexive and thoughtful about where we're coming from in the history that we are making. So I want to thank you very much for listening to this. I'll just end with, it's ironic Serge is here because I'm using one of his photographs here. You know, I encourage us all to embrace public history as a field of activity. It encourages you to think outside the building, and it encourages you to live your story, as a mural here in Ottawa says. And yeah, so I'll end there, and thanks very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Professor Dean. Very, very informative and fascinating talk. We learned so much. So we will invite questions at this stage. I see Professor Noor already has a question. So let's take Prof's question and then take two more, and that will form a round. Over to you, Prof.
Thanks very much, Kaswandi. I hope you can hear me. And thanks very much, David. That was really great. Okay, for several reasons. A lot of what you said resonates very strongly with our experience here, both in terms of activity in different spheres, and operating within spaces as a consultant, collaborator, co-producer. And I was interested in the way that you presented that initially as your evolution from the one to the other, But at the end, you were also saying that in your last project, you were acting as all three in one project. And I think that that for me raises a question about what our intentions might be as we operate in and with different publics, and the pressures that are brought to bear by different role players, and how our own role in those spaces can change, right? And how people perceive us, what they expect of us, and what we want to do. So there's a comment and a question about that sort of trajectory that you've set out, and the reality of being involved in particular projects. Secondly, and sort of related to that, and here I want to draw what I think is an important difference, because what you describe and analyze is a context that is very different from our context. And I want to make a bold statement, which I imagine is wrong, that there's a sharp divide between the possibilities of engaging in the kind of public history that you are involved in, and what we in a kind of a global South context can do. And I think that there are perhaps two issues. I'm sure there are more, but the one is about resources and the ability to simply do things in the way that you have. Not that it's absent, but I think it's incredibly more difficult. And secondly, it's a question of the state, government. And I wonder, whether you can reflect a bit more on the limitations and possibilities in undertaking public history in a context where the state can sometimes be more interventionist because they have the resources. So in our context, most of the museums are publicly resourced museums. Most of the heritage projects, the mega heritage projects, are largely funded by the state. So that engagement with different publics is often mediated by often interventionist state with particular political interests and objectives about what the outcome should be. And that therefore plays an important role in the way that we as historians engage those spaces, creates all sorts of complexities that one has to negotiate. My final comment, and this really, as Kasonde knows, is my final comment for the first round, is about archives. And I wonder whether in the work that you are engaged in, there is in fact also in the collaboration with different publics, the creation of new archives. What you have spoken about is the use of existing archives in the work that you do. But I wonder whether there's a process of constituting archives with the publics that you're working with. This is something which we are involved in at our university and with different groups and communities which we are working with, and thinking through the kind of constitution of archives from below, of course, drawing on the broad idea of history from below. But let me stop there. Thanks very much. I enjoyed that. Okay,
great. Thank you. Well, let me take the last question first, because I think that yes, we're using archives to inform our performances of the past, whether it's street art or whether it's exhibits or whether it's a theater production. But of course, in each of those engagements, we are creating our own archives, the archive of the production, the archive of the process. This isn't, and particularly with the Workers' History Museum, we're accumulating archives, particularly photographic and digital archives, but also oral histories that are new, and that are initiatives to tell a story about, let's say, industrialization, the process of colonization, of land seizure, land takeover, industrialization, basically destroying the land in some ways, transforming the land, and then post-industrialization and gentrification. Telling that story is generating its own archive, although we're using archival images and archival sources to initiate that story. We're generating archives that are new. And in fact, some of the images of that exhibit I showed, we're staging again as an exhibit, but we're bringing in workers from those plants to talk about their workspace. So we'll be creating an original archive of stories of people working everyday life of work in those spaces. So I think what I'd argue is that, yes, while we're using the archives to tell stories, in that process, we also uncover new stories, which creates new archives. I think going to the first question, which yes, I think absolutely this sort of this journey is a journey more within my soul or within my understanding of myself, as opposed to an accurate reflection of what was going on. So in the sense that, to some extent, yes, there was co-production elements in the theater, because even though I was there as a consultant, I ended up determining how some things would happen on stage. I think that, so but what emerged for me is that I think it's more in lines of what was expected of me, and how I resisted those expectations. So the notion that the past is known and fixed, and historians objectively uncover that past and have certainties because of that process, because of our expertise, was something that I think most historians would feel uncomfortable with to some degree, varying degrees. And so I was discovering myself in that process, and discovering that I was someone who, following Collingwood or whatever, thinks much more carefully about constructing my role as a constructor of the past, so the fiction in my writing of the past, or my thinking of the past, however we want to put it, and that I was raising possibilities and uncertainties when what was wanted was a straight answer that was absolutely right and could not possibly be shaken. And so what I realized through that process is that, well, a couple of things. One is that I was willing to be flexible about my archive and flexible about my source. And secondly, I realized that in engaging with that, I was in that way, I was working alongside, Freddie Rokem talks about actors as hyper historians, because they're recreating the past and the present on stage. And for the moment that they're on stage, they actually are the past. And I was witnessing some of those things. And as a witness of those performances, I learned new things about the past that I thought I knew from the archive. So yeah, I think there's elements of co-production and consultation in all of these processes, and all of these stages. But I guess what I was saying in a sense is that I began as a consultant because I was brought in to do that because of my expertise as an academic historian. And what I've left, when I come out of that journey 10 years later, I realize I'm really just a co-producer, and I not just, but I am a co-producer, and that the historical representations that I've been participant in, and I'm always labeled as a historical consultant in this. So if you don't like the history, blame him. I think is I've ended up actually influencing the way things look and the way things were performed or the way things are. But I've also had to make compromises, as I've said, and testing the boundaries of where I'm willing to compromise and where I'm not willing to compromise. And I think going to the larger question, then the second question, I think that it's interesting because absolutely there are places that you can do certain histories and places that you can't do certain histories. So I've been talking to colleagues, and I did some workshops in Indonesia where there are financial constraints, infrastructure constraints, political constraints for doing some of the sorts of projects we're doing. So for example, they are thinking of doing some of these street installations, but they have to limit them to strict archival images, and the stories they tell are vetted and approved or not approved. In fact, that's not that different from what I've experienced. To be honest, I've had to doctor images, I've had to change images because of policies, and you might call them innocent policies as opposed to political directive policies. But there's been other images that I haven't been able to use because they're not telling the stories that the community wants to tell, or they're not telling the stories that the city authorities want to tell. And for those, so stories that I thought were just straight stories, you know, just the past, ended up being deeply contentious. So, and I've had to not tell those stories. And so now that has also generated an alternative archive of the stories that I wasn't able to tell and the reason why I wasn't able to tell them, and which I'm keeping to myself at the moment, but will become something at some point. So I think absolutely there's a divide, but it's also an issue in the globe, in many parts of the global north. In Poland, for example, we've seen interventions in museums that are very direct. Even here in Canada, we've had interventions in museums from the state that not telling stories, making sure that we tell feel-good stories about our nation's history rather than the complex stories. So yeah, absolutely, we have the resources to do this, to do some of this work, which is other people don't. But you know, there's amazing work being done everywhere. Sophiatown, the story, all the work, the oral histories and projects in Sophiatown that I know about in South Africa is in some ways a deeper and more profound engagement with the community than some of the work that's been done here in Canada. Some of the dance work, the performance work that I've really valued is coming out of South Africa as well, and Ghana and Indonesia and places in the global South. So things that are forms of representing the past, which are, if you like, less structured, less resourced, are still very powerful and influential. And I know that, you know, we were chatting, Kasonde and I were chatting earlier about what the pandemic has meant. And one of the things we were sharing was that the pandemic has also meant that we're able to witness some of these performances online, which we haven't been able to do before. And some of these are very, you know, popular, bottom-up, poorly resourced performances that have been profound and really, really important. So yeah, acknowledging all the inequalities and all the divisions and all the different resources that are available, the different political circumstances, the sort of religious and ethnic tensions in many communities, the stories of trauma that we have here in Canada with Indigenous peoples resonates with those elsewhere as well, you know. So yeah, I think there's a lot of discussion to have about this. So thanks for those three questions and observations, Noor.
Thank you so much, Prof. I think Prof. Noor had to leave for another meeting, but this session is recorded. So I think he'll review your response later.
Okay.
So Professor Cynthia Cross has a comment in the chat section. It says, I'd be interested to hear what others have to say about the idea of co-producer. I have an uneasy feeling that sometimes it conceals how much power we actually have as academic historians. So that's one comment. I also have a couple of questions. I think as we wait for other people to share their thoughts and questions. So Professor Dean, I'm wondering how whether you view yourself as practicing perhaps a version of critical fabulation in your work with the different groups you've either been especially when you move further, from consultant to co-producer. And maybe related to that, I'm also curious, a lot of historians, especially working in universities, have limited resources, not just in terms of financial resources, but there's a lot of pressure in terms of time and teaching. In your experience and in your view, how can historians working in the academy with the huge pressure, especially with teaching, practice the kind of public history you have practiced? Because I think we can all agree that your career is really really inspiring. So maybe should we clone ourselves, or are there ways of of working that can make us engage the public in a more co-producing way?
Yeah, I think well, it's obviously enormously time consuming, and certain things have to go, right? So you have to make some choices as an academic historian. So I've not produced my, as another single authored historical monograph. The book you mentioned earlier, the migration book, is a co-edited book with a colleague in theater studies and a colleague in Black studies. And so you end up writing articles as opposed to writing monographs. And so that's a choice. And it's the other strategy I've had is to involve my students in these as co-producers, and that's a whole other layer of co-production that's fascinating. So the kiosk project, the street installations, the research was done initially in one group by a group of graduate students, and that was their coursework to design a box and take a box and collaborate. The other one was with 10 groups of 6 undergraduates who each took a site and told that story as part of their class project. So there's a way of integrating your teaching with these public outreach things, projects. And even with theater companies, I bring theater people into my history classes to talk about, and I do a class on early modern witchcraft, and we stage a play from the early modern period, but we use historical. So there's ways of integrating and streamlining, if you like, these. I think the second thing that's really important, and we're struggling with this in Canada, and all public historians everywhere talk about this, is getting the academic world to recognize the validity of an exhibit or a graphic novel or a street performance as equivalent to an article or equivalent to something when it comes to tenure and promotion. And that's particularly a struggle for my younger colleagues. And here at Carleton, we've overcome that now. If you produce a graphic novel or an exhibit or a video or some sort of street art performance, that's considered to be a valid academic endeavor in terms of promotion and your career. So that's an important struggle for younger colleagues, and it's one that is there. I was privileged because I'm older, and I got to a point where I'd already reached a position within the academic hierarchy that it didn't matter what I did, basically. And so I was able to take on these things, and I had the resources to support that. But for younger colleagues, it's a struggle, and they have to make those choices. So yeah, it's definitely an issue, and all public historians talk about this across the world. They talk about it in terms of this. There's also gender issues and other issues as well related to all of that. The co-production is, I think the intriguing question that Cynthia raises is, we do have a lot of power as academic historians, in the sense that you might be in the room and you're saying that's wrong, or that's fake history, or that's false history, and always people concede to you. There's no question about that. But on the other hand, when it comes to actually producing the representation, you realize that in fact the content or the story you want to tell and how you want to tell it gets limited to 60 words in a text panel. It gets subjected to the designer's inclination, and it gets subjected to political inclinations like the non-smoking policy of the city, so that you end up doctoring an image. And at those moments, you don't feel like you have much power or authority at all. And you have to make a decision whether you pull away or whether you engage and re-engage, but find an alternative. And this is where the website is the alternative archive, going back to Noor's point, where I will talk about how we had to doctor this historical image and why we had to do it, and open up to the public for a question. Is this okay? You know, are you comfortable with this? So yeah, I think that's it. Yeah.
Yes, there's a comment from Dr. Ariana Lisoni in the chat saying that in the South African context, we talk a lot about the politics of production, but don't think we really use the term co-producer. And then Professor Cross notes that I think it's starting to be used here. Heard it in a local seminar recently.
Yeah, it's really about you going in to be the academic specialist, the historical specialist, and realizing that at the end of the day, as an academic historian, when I go in as my expert for myself, I produce my monograph, and nobody has an effect on that. I mean, of course, editors do, and you get annoyed with editors and so on. But ultimately, it's my product. It's my production, it's my representation of the past, and I move on to the next one, regardless of whether people like it or not. If it's badly reviewed, I'm annoyed, but you know, if a movie producer doesn't pick it up as a script, I'm disappointed. But you know, ultimately, I've done my production and it's been fine, and I move on to the next one. As a co-producer, I've learned that, in fact, whether I get a chance to do the next one, the public has and the other stakeholders, other producers, my co-producers, have a big impact on that. Do they want to work with me next time? You know, or will they work with somebody else? Will they do any historical work? Will they decide to do another? So these traffic control boxes, some people are saying, well, you know, this is telling only one story. There's thousands of stories. There's too many stories to tell. We'll stop telling stories. We're just going to use art images on these boxes, and we'll just do an artwork, and that's neutral, and no one will worry about it. And you know, so and I have to count on my fellow co-producers to defend the historical stories we want to tell, because for me, these are subversive, popular histories from below that are suddenly appearing in public. These are little known stories about Ottawa's past. So, you know, I think that's, yeah.
Prof, I don't know if you see there's an active chat going on.
Yes, I have. Yeah, I've got it open here. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, disempowered. Yeah, I've shared that feeling for sure. Yeah. Yeah.
Hi, Mark. Hi, Professor Epprecht. He said, I agree with David on that last point. I feel pretty disempowered with a project I helped kick off. Okay. So there's more chat discussion there. I don't know if anyone wants to come on and speak. But I'm curious, we have a couple of minutes remaining. I'm curious, David, what the public's response, have there been any metrics in terms of, sorry, I'm a former NGO person, so
okay.
non-profit, in terms of the Capital History kiosks. You said there's a QR code. Is there like, you know, some? Yeah. How's the public responding?
Well, the short answer is, you would, as a co-producer of this project with me, you would be very disappointed in me and with the because we put up the QR codes, but we didn't put any analytics in there to track people visiting. We've just done that now. We've just relaunched the site. Again, my co-producer, grad student, redesigned the site and looked at me with just horror and disappointment. And when I said, oh, you can track visits to a website. So we're doing that now. What we do know is that the city's traffic statistics show that something like 35,000 pedestrians will go past these boxes on a summer's day. We have 5 months of winter here in Ottawa, so they don't look at them in winter because they're too cold and they're just rushing by. But we know that, so we know people see them, but we don't know how many people go onto the website. We're going to start tracking that now. What we do know, though, is that when they get damaged, a car hits them or they need to be replaced, there usually is an outcry, or somebody will comment to the city councillors saying what's happened to the box. And so we've had to do some fundraising to replace these when they get damaged. And so as far as we know, that they are quite popular, but that's our only. The city of Ottawa likes them because the vinyl is graffiti proof. So you just wipe the graffiti off. So they also, apart from the beautification policy of the city, it's also got a practical value as well. So we know they're quite popular with the city itself, but they don't care about whether it's a history so much. But while they do, they want to tell stories of Ottawa's past, but other images would also work, like a photograph or contemporary artwork would work as well. But yeah, so this time next year, I'll be able to answer that question. And I hope we have some traffic, because I really don't know how many people use our smartphone app or use the QR code to tell the story, to look at more deeply at the story. And I'll be disappointed if there isn't, because that's where I get to tell my story about the cigarettes having to be disappear, right? That's where I can tell it. And that's where I'm wondering whether I should have hidden, like the way Mark is hiding, because if the city of Ottawa hears me talking about that, they might get frustrated with me. But I think it's an important story to tell. You know, that I felt like I was some sort of Russian, Soviet, Stalinist, a sort of Stalinist person taking Trotsky out of the photographs of the Politburo, doctoring original sources. I mean, that's hard for a historian, right?
Yes, I can imagine. So Professor Cross has another comment there. I think it's addressed to Dave. So I think I don't see any hands. I will invite you, David, to maybe make some closing remarks. And the History Workshop again wants to thank you for coming to our seminar series and sharing with us a very inspiring and fascinating and thought-provoking presentation. As you've seen in the chat, it's provoked a lot of comment. We thank you for getting up early. I hope we were worth it as an audience.
Yes, no, fantastic. Wonderful, thought-provoking questions that I'm going to be thinking about for the rest of the day. I just maybe will just close by saying that I agree with Cynthia. This is very complicated and it can be very hard. We've had a lot of struggles within the museum, for example, that I work with, on whether we should be cooperating with land developers, because land developers want to use heritage as a selling point. And do we want to buy into that and be part of that process when we actually feel that the land has been stolen and should be returned, in my case, and other colleagues don't agree with that at all. They think that development is fine and that we should join with the developers and insist on some heritage. So yeah, there's some stories are considered to be illegitimate, and all as I can say is that I think our role as a historian there, as an academic historian, is to reassure people that there's always different interpretations of the past. There has always been. That's what the writing of history is. That's historiography. And that we're used to being in spaces where different stories, competing stories, are voiced, and we see the value in offering both interpretations, both those stories, and pointing out that some people see this as illegitimate and other people see this as controversial. And that's where I think a lot of the most valuable, going back to Noor's point, I think the most valuable public history work is actually nothing that I'm doing at all. The most valuable work is the work to at where there are deep controversies, the work on the trauma, the genocide that we committed here in Canada against Indigenous peoples, and uncovering those stories, and the work that's going on in Sri Lanka post-Civil War, the work that's going on in many countries of the world, public history work, where yes, stories, this point of view is considered to be totally illegitimate and totally untrue, but that's a perspective that needs to be brought out and shared. And I think we're used to those sorts of controversies as historians, although usually in a safer context, in the context of historiography. It matters and it's important. And, we've seen the consequences of that of not being part of that process in many parts of the world. South of the border here in Canada, we've seen that with Trump and all of that, right? That historians needed to stand up and step out and live their story and think outside the building. We needed to get there, get involved. And yeah, so I don't think it's really unrealistic to be a co-producer, but I think it's certainly challenging, and it's certainly, yeah, it's difficult. It's difficult work, for sure. Yeah. But thanks so much for the invitation. It's been wonderful. Questions are fabulous, and I'll be thinking about this all day and for the weeks to come. So, yeah.
Great. We see
Okay.
some sunshine there in the background. I
Oh,
hope
yeah.
you have a great day. Thank you for everyone who has joined us today. This is actually our last webinar for the year, for the academic year. We look forward to seeing everyone back next year, either virtually or in person, hopefully the latter, but everyone stay safe. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks for hosting so well.
Thanks very much, David.
Okay.
And enjoy
Thanks,
the rest
David.
of your day.
Okay. Bye.
David, okay.